Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. It has been so long since I talked to you, I know, but if you're like me and my frisky kitty in the background who just wanted to say hi, we've had quite a summer and I'm sure you've been busy as well. So let's get caught up here. We are reading Brené Brown's new book, Atlas of the Heart. I would show it, except that like I do sometimes with hardcovers, I took the coverlet off and I don't know what I did with it right now, so it'll just remain hidden in the background. But we are on chapter 7, the places we go with others. Remember that last video was pretty hard. This one is not as hard, but it does have some pretty difficult words. And also I was thinking as I was reading it how timely it is, and I know some of my readers that are watchers, I should say, that I know in person. We've actually had personal discussions about these things recently, so it really is timely, and I think that you'll know who I'm talking about when you watch this. So, where are the places that we go with others? Do you find yourself feeling other people's emotions or getting caught up with something that you see on the news? The words that Brené uses for this chapter are compassion, pity, empathy, sympathy, boundary, and comparative suffering. You want to say hello, huh? I just got home, so she's wanting attention. I'll give her some little love in the background here. Okay. I think we all are probably familiar with a lot of those. Like, I was not familiar with the comparative suffering. But this is, and bear with me, this is a complicated chapter because some of these words that maybe we think we know or we have a certain connotation with them when we hear them are different in Brené's research. So the first one is compassion and empathy. And I mentioned, did you feel like you feel other people's feelings? That is what I think of when I think of empathy. I think of like being an empath or feeling like I know someone else's pain or maybe happiness. It doesn't have to be all sadness, but because we can go with people to happy places too. So compassion. Do you think of Mother Teresa? I think of Mother Teresa. So this is one big quote that she has on one of the pages. Compassion is fueled by understanding and accepting that we're all made of strength and struggle. No one is immune to pain or suffering. Compassion is not a practice of better than or I can fix you. It's a practice based in the beauty and pain of shared humanity. So Brené thinks that she uses compassion as a term, like an umbrella term, which empathy is a part of. So that makes sense, right? Because I think of that definition sort of as empathy. So let's see what else she says. So, and also remember this book, a lot of this book is about what connects us to other people through experiences and feelings. So these words that we're going to talk about tonight are a lot about connection, because you know how that is when somebody tells you about an experience, and even though you might not be going through it in yourself in your own life, you feel for your friend or family member, but you also know that pain in your own way in your own life. So you can definitely relate, I guess would be another word to say. So she talks about the difference between compassion and empathy here. There is a significant difference, she says, and it's vital to understand that we want to cultivate connection with others, like I just said. There are also different definitions and types of empathy. She says she's going to try to sort it out here, and I'm going to read a lot of it because as I was reading, I was thinking, how the heck am I going to remember all of this? Because like I said, it's pretty detailed and a little bit tricky. So this is what she learned through her research. Compassion is a daily practice, and empathy is a skill set that is one of the most powerful tools of compassion. So like I said, empathy is like a part of compassion. Our working definition of compassion first emerged from the data about 10 years ago. it's been revised over time, but the core has remained the same and has stood the test of new data. Compassion, again, is a daily practice of recognizing and accepting our shared humanity so that we treat others and ourselves with loving kindness, and we take action in the face of suffering. So if you think about there's a war going on, or there was an earthquake or something like that, and you have compassion for the people, even though you may not even be able to relate to what they're going through, you might take action by donating or visiting the area and helping with the recovery efforts or something like that. So compassion is fueled by the understanding and accepting. Oh, this is the same thing I read before on the other page. This is just where it is in the book. That we all have that strength and struggle. So I guess when I think about compassion, I think you might not totally relate to the situation at hand, but you have compassion for the fact that we're all humans and we all go through difficult things. And so you want to be a part of the solution if you can. Although she did say it's not just the practice of, can I fix you? There's a book she mentions here that I thought sounds intriguing. It's called The Places That Scare You. And it's by Pema Chodron, the Buddhist, if you've heard of her. And she talks about generating compassion. And that is a big part of Buddhism, I know. And even in the Indian culture, in the Bhagavad Gita, I know that they are always trying to have that loving kindness. And I remember in the movie Eat, Pray, Love, where Julia Roberts, the main character, Liz is the character's name, where she's having trouble with that text because she needs to focus it on a person. So they have her focus it on a person, and that can spread to the whole world, whether or not she's focusing on the one person or the whole world. But she found it easier to focus on the one person. So there's a whole Buddhist part of this from that book that's interesting. I want to read a little bit more about empathy because I feel like she's focusing more on the compassion part of it. And they're talking about, and she's mentioned this before in the book, about some emotions being good and some being bad, but she doesn't agree with that. She wants this book, I think the message is that we have to honor all of them, right? All of our feelings, like all of these places in our heart. So she has, I think in this paragraph that I'm just skimming right now in this moment, she's talking about weighing the difference between empathy and compassion as one being better than the other, but she wants that to be thrown out the window. There really is more of a focus on the compassion. So I don't have much more that I can say about empathy, except to say that as an empathetic person, I do feel like I will often cry, with someone about something sad because I know that pain. So am I going to be compassionate about it and take action? Maybe. Empathy is just a part of that experience. It sounds like compassion is something more that you're contemplating and building, kind of like if you meditate every day. So you can bring compassion to the world and to your life by practicing it. And then maybe empathy is more of a situational experience. You might have empathy for those people. Well, I don't know, maybe you went through a war or an earthquake or something like that. And then in that case, you would have empathy because you would know that feeling. So compassion, from what she's saying, it's more of a broad term, and it's the umbrella term of which empathy is a part of. What about pity? And I think she's talking about all these things are, like, I think about somebody dying or having a hard experience because of the pity, suffering, sympathy, things like that. So I don't know. She's not going to label this one as negative, but when I think about pity, I sort of think of it as a negative thing of sort of like, oh, you poor thing. And in the back of your mind, it's like, I'm so glad that's not me. You know, it's like there's a lack of the empathy or the compassion in that. That's just my thought of it. So pity is the near enemy of compassion, she says. And then far enemies are the opposites of emotions or experiences. The far enemy of compassion might be cruelty. So that would be like the total opposite end of the spectrum from compassion. But pity is still on that I feel sorry for you sort of spectrum, right? But it's close. But it like lacks that compassion and empathy. And she does say that sometimes near enemies, like these two emotions or words or feelings, they can actually be a little more destructive than far enemies. The near enemy of compassion is pity, like I said. Instead of feeling the openness of compassion, pity says, oh, that poor person, I feel so sorry for people like that. Pity sees them as different from ourselves, so outside. So like in the war situation, it could be just, oh, I feel so bad for those people. And then just going about your day, but not taking any action, not even bringing like a true feeling to it. It's just like, oh, I feel sorry for them in one moment. It sets up a separation between ourselves and others. It's a sense of distance and remoteness from the suffering of others that is affirming, and it's sort of gratifying to the self. Like I said, it's more like, thank God that's not me, you know, those are my words. Compassion, on the other hand, recognizes the suffering of another as a reflection of our own pain collectively. I understand this. I suffer in the same way. It is empathetic, a mutual connection with the pain and sorrow of life. And listen to this. Compassion is shared suffering. So we're kind of like putting ourselves in the person's shoes. And again, we might not have ever experienced the same thing as them, but we know that it's a part of life and we feel for them because we know we're all going to be in that position in some way. Maybe not the exact circumstances, but in some way. So pity involves 4 elements: a belief that the suffering person is inferior, a passive, self-focused reaction that does not include providing help, a desire to maintain emotional distance, and the avoidance of sharing in the other person's suffering. I know I keep bringing up the war, but say you're watching the news, oh, that's so terrible. Click, and then going on with your life, you're like, I'm not going to take that in. I'm not going to think about what it must be like to suffer for the people, and I'm just going to put it out of my mind. So you might have pity, so you still care in some respects, but you're just not, you're wanting to have a distance, right? You're just not involving yourself. Another enemy of compassion is despair, and we talked about despair in the last chapter. Compassion does not mean that we have to immerse ourselves in the suffering of others to the point of anguish. So you don't have to, get so involved in somebody else's situation or like a whole country of suffering people in war or something. You can still have a boundary, and we are going to talk about boundaries. And compassion embraces the experiences, sorrows, and it eliminates any cruelty that might be there in like parts of the pity, right? Here's more on empathy. Okay, good, because I thought there was more. Empathy is the most powerful tool of compassion. Again, it falls under that compassion umbrella. It's an emotional skill set that allows us to understand what someone has experienced and to reflect back that understanding. So yeah, when you're talking to somebody or you're just with them and they're going through something, it's a shared understanding that like, hey, I get it. I've been there. This is awful. She does talk about whether or not you're bringing up the situation that you were into or not. Sometimes it's just being there and just being like, let's just sit. Like, there's nothing I can say. I know that when I went through something like this, I just wanted to be in a dark room, or I just wanted to have somebody there with me just to know that I wasn't alone to go through this. But I don't want to talk about it. I don't even want to think about it. So sort of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, but not necessarily saying like, oh, I remember when this happened or such and such, and almost trying to like compare it, because that doesn't work for everybody. But at least they know that in some way you understand, right? And then you're seeing them. I think that's a big thing of connection and being a human. Most research agrees that there are two elements of empathy: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy, sometimes called perspective taking or mentalizing, is the ability to recognize and understand another person's emotions. Affective empathy, often called experience sharing, is one's own emotional attunement with another person's experience. So that's kind of like the being part of it with the person versus maybe the sharing that I mentioned. And I like what Brené says here. Based on my work, I believe meaningful connection requires a combination of compassion and cognitive empathy or perspective taking. In simple terms, the empathy I'm talking about is understanding what someone is feeling, but not feeling it for them. So again, like, compassion didn't mean that you were getting completely drawn into the vortex of that horribleness that someone else was going through. You were still able to, you weren't being distant like the pity part, but you were still able to kind of maintain your own view of it and not getting so wrapped up in the other person's feelings. I think, and we know the word empath, and there are a lot of people who are true, like, spiritual empaths, and sometimes they have to consciously separate themselves from someone else, or they can actually sense without the person telling them sometimes, like, something's off, something must not be right with this person, or maybe they're mad at me, or, they can just sort of feel like the feelings in the air or the energy. There's more about empathy in here, but it gets very detailed, so I would encourage you to read. It's on page 122 mostly. And one thing that she says in her research, she says, we need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes rather than walking in your shoes. I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell about what it's like in your shoes and believe you even if it doesn't match my experience. That's true, because somebody could be way more emotional. Hello. Somebody could be way more emotional than you, or be blowing something, in your opinion, out of proportion when you think like, well, I went through that. Actually, she gives a situation at work. When I was reading this before, I remember that someone at work, an example is somebody feels not seen in a meeting and doesn't feel called on and stuff like that. And so another coworker is thinking in their head like, well, I don't know what they're getting so bent out of shape about. Like, I don't care if they call on me in a meeting. But that's totally discounting the person's feelings. It doesn't matter whether you would feel the same way or not. We're all different. We're all wired differently. So somehow having empathy and compassion and being able to say, like, I'm sorry that you feel that way, and I know how it feels to be unseen or whatever. But maybe you can't relate to the feeling of being unseen in that situation, but you can still have empathy about it because you know where that feeling's coming from, even if it's not the same thing that you would experience in that moment. So that's what she's saying. So she also says that we're going to be talking more about something in the final chapter here. Accountability. Okay. So then we get into sympathy, and we think about, so we've been talking about empathy, compassion, pity. What is sympathy? We we send sympathy cards, right? It's usually, I think of when there's been a death. That's the section of the cards in the card store, right? But is sympathy always good? Like, obviously, an acknowledgement of someone's loss would be a good part of sympathy. But if someone's, sitting in a cancer ward and you're expressing sympathy about their experience, meanwhile, they might be trying to sum up the will to live or think about the good things, then sympathy's not really going to feel great to that person, right, in that situation. So remember how she said one of the other ones was a near enemy? This sympathy and pity are first cousins, she says. They're the emotions that we feel bad for you from way over here, where the kind of misery you're experiencing doesn't happen to us. So there is a bit of a distance. So I don't really like that when I think about, although I hate sympathy cards, and I just said that to somebody recently who I sent a sympathy card to, because I hate what they say. They try to be so nice, but it's just a horrible situation. So why don't they make a sympathy card that just says, like, this sucks or something like that, Yeah, it's just, I don't know. They try to make a beautiful spin on it, but that's not what everybody's ready to hear in the moment of the card arriving. So remember what Brené said about dispelling the myth of walking in someone else's shoes being the empathy part. And so the minute that I try to put myself in your place rather than try to understand the situation from your perspective, our empathetic connection unravels. So it would be like that work situation where I would discount your feelings by saying, like, well, I wouldn't feel like that, or it's not really that big of a deal. That's not being empathetic or having sympathy. She doesn't say that much about sympathy here. Empathy and pity are not the same thing. But what about sympathy, though? Sympathy can be a trigger for shame. Yeah, so that would be kind of like the situation I mentioned of being in a cancer ward. And that person, maybe they would feel ashamed for thinking that they wanted to live or that they were going to make it through the battle, and then everybody else is just coming in and saying, like, oh, this must be such a hard time. Or maybe it's even a family member. It's not the cancer person, but it's a family member that is trying to support the person, and everybody's feeling bad for them, and they're thinking, like, they don't know how this is going to turn out. Like, don't give me sympathy right now. I think the best thing would be the compassion, to just understand that we all might be in that position, and then maybe do something like help out or bring meals or blankets or clothes or whatever you can do. So what about compassion fatigue? I think about this, and I think that our country is like this sometimes, where for a week after some horrible tragedy, everybody's like, oh, did you donate to the earthquake, or did you do this or do that? And then they're on to the next thing. And then after a while, everybody just is like, well, yeah, I'm just going to shut off my emotions to that because I don't have enough money and time to give to all these things that are constantly happening around the world. So this is a term used to refer to the emotional exhaustion or burnout that can occur among caregivers. So, yeah, that can happen too in a personal situation, like somebody taking care of a cancer patient, like I said. Or even doctors, nurses, physicians, therapists. Yeah. I can't imagine if you were a therapist and all day long, if you had people that were just so depressed and you were working so hard to try to uplift them, and then at the end of the day, you would really have to separate yourself in some way. You couldn't really be that empathetic as a therapist, or else you would just not be able to sleep at night probably, because you'd probably spiral into your own depression. So there would have to be a boundary. There's compelling research that shows that compassion fatigue occurs when caregivers focus on their own personal distress reaction rather than the experience of the person they're caring for. That's true too, because it can be really hard to be a caretaker. But if you stop focusing on the person that you're taking care of and you're more concerned about how difficult it is for you as the caretaker, then that could definitely turn into fatigue. So Brené says the last thing I want to say is the number one question I get when I'm teaching empathy is, how can I be empathetic with someone if I haven't had their experience? This is kind of like what I was saying earlier. It's a great question because it exposes a dangerous myth about empathy. Empathy is not relating to an experience, it's connecting to what someone is feeling about an experience. When I'm working with groups, I often ask participants to raise their hands if they've known joy, hurt, heartbreak, shame. Oh, she's got a little thing in the middle here. Grief, love, etc. And at the end, after all the hands have been raised in every emotion, I say, you're qualified. You don't need to be an expert or experience what they've experienced. That's a good point. All right, so what about having boundaries? Like I mentioned, the therapists and probably nurses and doctors too. They can care in the moment, but then they sort of have to detach, I'm assuming, right? Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously, so you don't lose yourself in it. It's a prerequisite for compassion and empathy to have boundaries. That's what Brené says. We can't connect with someone unless we're clear about where we end and they begin. Wow, right? Wow. If there's no autonomy between people, then there's no compassion or empathy. That's just enmeshment. Think about that. So you still have to remain yourself and your own emotions. You might get caught up in someone else's pain, but you have to know where you end and they begin. That's really good advice. She does talk a lot about compassion in The Gifts of Imperfection, which we also read last year. Yeah, 2021. That is one of her guideposts, isn't it? To have compassion? Yeah. The best definition of boundaries, she says it comes from her friend Kelly Ray Roberts. After experiences with some of her art students copying her work and selling it, she addressed her art community with a very straightforward blog on what's okay and what's not okay in terms of using her images. For example, it's okay to be inspired by my work, but it's not okay to copy it and sell it. That's a boundary, right? This is simple but profound. It's a profound way to set boundaries. Clear and kind. Unclear is unkind. I don't like when people don't have boundaries. I'd rather just have them tell me the way it is, even if I have to be sort of taken aback. But then I'm clear. I don't like when it's unclear. Too often we forget about what is okay. Yeah, and that leads us into unnecessary disconnection. When people set a boundary with us, we can feel that they're denying us our right to our thinking and feeling. Yeah, that's true. When we explain up front that that's okay, we move the focus to where it belongs. This expression of your feelings or thinking is the problem. Like, that's what you might be thinking. I'm thinking about a situation in my own life where, somebody didn't want to include me in a difficult situation they were going through. And I did take that personally, but I think it was the right thing. It was still hurtful at the time, but they had the right to do that. And I think there was a boundary set, which I appreciated. It was a surprise because this person doesn't typically have boundaries, although over the years they have acquired them. But so it was like the first time in my life that I had experienced not being a part of something in this person's life. So that was a learning experience for me. But thinking back, I do appreciate the fact that a boundary was set. And I would rather have that than a wishy-washy situation, like I said before. As hard as it was, you know, and things, you can go through difficult things and they can change your life in good ways and bad ways. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be like that forever, because as things change in friendships and family relationships change, then life changes and sometimes things come back together too. Yeah. That's very vague, but hopefully that made sense. So she gives some examples of boundaries, like it's okay to be pissed. It's not okay to raise your voice and pound on the table. These sound like parenting things. It's okay to change your mind. It's not okay to assume that I'm okay with the changes that you're talking to me about. It's okay to want to be able to do things that your friends are allowed to do. I totally get that. What's not okay is breaking our rules and doing them anyway. It's okay to disagree with me, but it's not okay to ridicule my ideas and beliefs. Those are very assertive comments. I don't know that we're all armed with that when we're growing up, right? All right, so here's this last one that I said I wasn't necessarily familiar with before reading this. So it's called comparative suffering. And I think this is the one. Okay, well, I'll just read what she says. Empathy is not finite, and compassion is not a pizza with 8 slices. When you practice empathy and compassion with someone, there is not less of these qualities to go around. That's a good point. There's more. Love is the last thing we need to retain in this world, or ration in this world, sorry. Yeah, that's true. But fear and scarcity trigger comparison, and even pain and hurt are not immune to being assessed and ranked. So I'm going to just read a few of the examples. My husband died, and that grief is worse than your grief over missing your daughter's wedding. She's talking about some things from COVID. I'm not allowed to talk about how disappointed I am about my job changing because my friend just found out that his wife has COVID. So, okay. So maybe you're going through something, but you feel like you can't express it, or, you know, because I'm not allowed to feel these things, or maybe like my pain is worse than yours, like I'm suffering more than you. That's what the comparative suffering is defined as. Perspective is critical, she says. I'm a firm believer that sharing how we feel, even complaining, is okay as long as we piss and moan with a little perspective. Hurt is hurt, and every time we honor our own struggle and the struggles of others by responding with empathy and compassion, the healing that results affects all of us. I think that's a really beautiful chapter, and I feel like she said more in it than she has in other chapters. You know how I've said that when she's presenting these things, sometimes the chapter just ends and I want more? I feel like even just that closing paragraph sort of put a bow on this whole chapter, and gave us kind of a message of what's important with these words. So that was a lot. What do you guys think about those things? Do you feel yourself going there with other people? Maybe you don't know how to express some of these emotions too, or they make you really uncomfortable. There is a whole 2-page spread about people that are trying to be empathetic. It's called Empathy Misses. That's worth looking at as well. It's on page 126 and 127 of the book. So hope you found that chapter to be insightful and that you're getting something out of reading the book. I need to get caught up because here we are almost in the month of September and I haven't even done chapter 8, but I will get caught up. Probably as the weather is not as nice, I will be inside a little bit more. I've just been trying to savor any time outside that I'm not working. Love to you all, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.